This is Economist.com, and we're speaking with Tom Standage, Technology Quarterly editor of The Economist, about nuclear power. Tom, several articles in the most recent issue of Technology Quarterly suggest that nuclear power's prospects look brighter now than they have in a long time. Why would that be?
Well, there's two things going on. The first is concern about climate change, obviously, and the second is concern about energy security. And both have traditionally been used to justify nuclear power, but the case for each of those justifications has got a lot stronger lately. In particular, the oil price being much higher means people are looking around, and the economics of nuclear suddenly looks a lot better. It's now competitive with gas in terms of price per kilowatt hour, pretty much. So it's economically standing up a bit better. And also, when you've had Vladimir Putin throwing his weight around in the way that he has been the last couple of years, people worried about, in Western Europe in particular, where they're going to get their gas from, then nuclear starts to look a lot more attractive. And the French situation, where you've got 80% of the electricity coming from nuclear because they decided years ago that they wanted to be more self-sufficient in energy, that suddenly looks like quite a nice position to be in. So we're seeing a revival of interest in nuclear on many fronts, in America most strongly, but also in parts of Western Europe. Some governments are starting to make noises about this. It's not going to be an easy sell because many countries shut down their nuclear programs or froze them during the 80s and 90s. So in Sweden and Germany in particular, the politicians are going to find it very difficult to persuade the electorate to do this. But they ought to be giving it a try, we argue in this week's issue. That this is a very good way if they're going to try and meet their Kyoto targets to reduce their emissions. And the technology has moved on since the first generation of nuclear power stations and the second generation were built in the last few decades. So the modern reactors are more efficient. They should be safer. They should require less maintenance. They'll run for longer. So they have a lot to recommend them. And all of this adds up to a sort of renaissance for nuclear power.
Could you talk a little bit more about the technological advances that have led to a new generation of nuclear power plants being safer and more efficient?
Yes. For a start, now that we've had nuclear plants running in many parts of the world for some decades, the companies that run them have had quite a lot of experience, and the companies that build them have been able to draw upon that. So we have new, simpler designs that have fewer motors and pumps and pipes and things to go wrong, and that ought to reduce maintenance and repair costs and the amount of time that the reactors are offline. Another popular thing that's in many of the new designs are so-called passive safety features, and these shut a reactor down if anything goes wrong, like the coolant flow gets blocked, without the need for human intervention. So to give an example, one of these new designs has a tank of high-pressure water that sits next to the reactor vessel. And if there's a loss of pressure in the main reactor vessel because the coolant leaks or something like that, then the pressure will drop in the reactor vessel, and this will allow the water at higher pressure in the neighboring tank to come in. And it's actually higher up, so it's actually forced in by gravity. So this just happens on its own if there's a problem with the main reactor vessel. And there are several examples of these kinds of technologies. And there are forthcoming reactor designs called pebble bed designs, which take this even further. And essentially, the design of the reactor and the architecture of it means that there's an inherent limit on how hot the reactor can get. The hotter it gets, the less efficient the nuclear reaction itself becomes, and that then causes it to cool down. And so proponents of this design say it's actually impossible for these kinds of reactors to melt down. The other thing it's worth saying is that the Chernobyl accident involved the design of a reactor that has never even been deployed in the West. So, the kind of reactors we're talking about building in America and Western Europe, they're improvements on a design that's already much safer than the Chernobyl reactor. The other thing is, rather more prosaically, with the existing reactors that are out there, the operators have figured out how to run them very well. They're online much more of the time. Refueling and maintenance takes much less time. Typically, reactors are online 90% of the time now in America, rather than 70% just a few years ago. And operators have also figured out how to squeeze the last extra efficiencies out of the steam turbines that the nuclear power stations actually use to generate electricity. So all of these things add up to a stronger technological case for nuclear power. And, of course, the political and economic factors seem to be moving in their favor as well.
If we do see a new rise in the use of nuclear power, who do you think might be leading the way?
Well, it's clearly going to be America at the moment. There are going to be something like 30 applications for new power stations between now and the end of 2008. And this is because there are various incentives that the government's put in place that may expire after that. And so the NRC, the body in America that regulates nuclear power, is actually staffing up now to handle this expected deluge of new applications. There hasn't been a new application to build a nuclear power plant in America for nearly 30 years, and we just had the first one put in July, and then there's going to be dozens more to follow. Clearly, there's going to be a lot of activity in America. Finland is building the first new plant in Western Europe for quite a while, and also for about 30 years, and that's based on one of these new designs. Another one is just being built in France. In Britain, the Prime Minister looks as though he wants to expand the nuclear program in Britain, and that's going to be a hard sell. But as I say, it's going to be an even harder sell in some other Western European countries. And in the developing world, all sorts of things are going on. Turkey and Vietnam are considering starting nuclear power programs. China and India are building several reactors and plan to increase their generating capacity several times over. So there's an awful lot going on.
Tom, what about nuclear waste? What would happen with that if these new plants were built?
Well, obviously, nuclear waste is the question. How do you deal with it? And there's progress there as well. There are various plans afoot in America to reverse its ban on reprocessing. And one of the things that reprocessing lets you do is take the spent fuel from a nuclear reactor and extract the really radioactive stuff from it. And then you can actually burn that in another kind of nuclear reactor called a fast reactor. And then the upshot, say, proponents of this scheme is that you end up with less nuclear waste, and the nuclear waste you have is less strong. Essentially, this is the environmental argument against nuclear power, concerns over waste and possible accidents and so on. And also in TQ this quarter, we have an interview with Stuart Brand, who is a pioneer of the Green movement in the 60s. And interestingly, he is one of many Greens who have changed their minds about nuclear power. Having initially opposed it, he now thinks that on balance, the risk of dealing with the waste and of nuclear accidents and so on is smaller than the risk of runaway climate change, and that therefore he thinks Greens should be in favour of nuclear power.
Tom, thank you for speaking with us. You've been listening to an interview with Tom Standage, Technology Quarterly editor of The Economist. You can read the most recent Technology Quarterly and past issues at www.economist.com/science/TQ.